There's a mystery hidden in the story of Abraham that few ever talk about. A detail so shocking, it could change everything you thought you knew about the man called the Father of Nations. Why did God command him to leave everything behind? What really happened on Mount Moriah? And could it be that Abraham's journey still affects us today? The truth is deeper than you think, and by the end of this story, you'll see Abraham in a way you never have before. But here's something that will surprise you. Abraham wasn't always the faithful, unwavering man we think he was. His journey was filled with doubts, missteps, and moments of fear. And the story of Abraham is not just about his triumphs, but also about his struggles. He wasn't just a man of faith, he was a man who had to learn faith. Imagine being told to leave behind everything you've ever known. Your home, your family, your comfort, all for a promise that seems impossible. That's exactly what happened to Abraham. But why him? Why did God choose Abraham? And what did he have to leave behind? His story is more than just a journey across deserts. It's a journey of the soul, of trust, and of a faith that was tested again and again. And as we walk through his life, you'll begin to see, maybe Abraham's story isn't so different from ours after all. The deeper we look, the more we uncover. From ancient Mesopotamian traditions to long-lost biblical connections, Abraham's story is layered with mysteries waiting to be revealed. How did a man from a pagan city become the chosen one to start a divine legacy? What hidden messages lie within his encounters? And could it be that his life is still shaping our world today? Stay with me as we unravel the complete story of Abraham, the father of nations, but also a man just like us. Before diving into Abraham's personal journey, let's take a brief look at the world he inherited. In the days following the Tower of Babel, when humanity was once united by a single language and a common ambition, pride and disobedience fractured that unity. Instead of following God's plan for spreading across the earth, people sought to make a name for themselves, and the consequences were dire. It was in this broken world that Abraham's journey began. So before we begin, Abraham's name was not originally Abraham. His real name was Abram, which means exalted father in Hebrew. But later in his journey, God changed his name to Abraham, meaning father of a multitude. Abram was born in the city of Ur. He grew up surrounded by idol worship. His family was wealthy, and his father, Terah, even made idols for a living. But then something incredible happened. God spoke to him. And with that, everything changed. God said to Abraham, "Leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land I will show you." This wasn't just a request, it was a test. Abram was being asked to walk away from everything he knew, to leave behind comfort, security, and his past. And what's even more astonishing, he obeyed without question. But why? What drove Abram to trust in a voice no one else could hear? The answer lies in something ancient Jewish traditions hint at. Abram had already begun questioning the gods of his time. Legends say that as a young man, he once smashed his father's idols, proving his faith in the one true God long before he ever heard his voice. But leaving home was just the beginning. What followed was a series of trials that tested his faith in ways that would break most people. Imagine this, leaving behind a life of security for a future filled with nothing but uncertainty. He didn't have a map, a destination, or even a clear idea of what lay ahead. All he had was a promise that he would become a great nation, that his descendants would be as countless as the stars. But how do you hold on to a promise when everything around you seems to fall apart? Abram faced famine almost immediately after leaving Ur. Instead of being rewarded for his faith, he was thrown into hardship. And when he sought refuge in Egypt, he made a critical mistake. Out of fear, he lied about Sarai being his wife. This wasn't a moment of unwavering trust. This was a moment of fear, of survival instinct. And yet, God remained faithful. Years passed, and still, there was no child. Sarai, desperate and losing hope, convinced Abram to take Hagar, her maidservant, to bear him a child. Ishmael was born, but this was not the son of the promise. Conflict arose, doubt grew, and the vision of a great nation seemed further away than ever. How could Abram believe in a promise when everything pointed to its impossibility? And then, when he was 99 years old, when all hope seemed lost, God appeared to him once again. He gave Abram a new name, Abraham, meaning father of many nations, and he reaffirmed the promise. Sarah, despite her old age, would bear him a son. A miracle was coming. But could Abraham believe it after all this time? Could he truly trust that God would deliver on a promise that seemed impossible? This was the challenge. Not just leaving his home, but believing in something that seemed absurd. Holding on to faith when everything around him screamed doubt. Trusting in a God who worked in ways that defied human logic. And Abraham wasn't alone in this struggle. We too face moments where God's promises seem distant, where faith feels like a battle against reason. But just like Abraham, we are called to trust, not in what we see, but in the one who sees beyond it all. From the moment he stepped out of Ur, Abram's journey was anything but easy. He traveled with his wife, Sarai, and his nephew Lot, facing famine, betrayal, and war. But through it all, he clung to God's promises. Imagine walking into the unknown, not knowing where your next meal will come from or what dangers lie ahead. That was the reality for Abraham. He had left behind everything, his homeland, his relatives, and the security of a familiar life. All he had was a promise from God and the faith that it would be fulfilled. As he traveled through foreign lands, he was a stranger among people who did not know or worship his God. Every step he took was a step of faith, trusting that God would lead him where he was meant to go. But faith does not eliminate hardship, it tests it. The first great challenge came quickly. A famine swept through the land, leaving Abraham with no choice but to seek refuge in Egypt. This was a moment of trial, one that revealed both his fears and his weaknesses. Instead of relying on God, he took matters into his own hands. Fearing that the Egyptians would kill him to take his wife, Sarai, he told a half-truth, claiming she was his sister rather than his wife. This deception nearly cost him everything. Pharaoh, believing Sarai was unmarried, took her into his palace. Yet despite Abraham's mistake, God intervened. He sent plagues upon Pharaoh's household, revealing the truth and forcing Pharaoh to return Sarai to Abraham. In the end, they left Egypt unharmed, but the experience served as a reminder. Faith is not just about stepping out. It is about trusting God, even in the face of fear. Abraham's journey was not just a physical one. It was a spiritual test. Could he trust God when everything seemed uncertain? Could he rely on divine guidance rather than his own understanding? These were the questions that would follow him for the rest of his life. And soon, his faith would be tested again. But this time, not by famine or fear, but by war. One of the most mysterious figures in Abraham's story is Melchizedek, a priest king who appeared seemingly out of nowhere after Abraham's victorious battle. His presence was brief, yet his significance echoed through history. Who was this man? Why did he bless Abraham? And why did he bring out bread and wine, a ritual that would later hold deep spiritual meaning? To understand this encounter, we must first look at what led up to it. Abraham had just returned from a dangerous mission. His nephew, Lot, had been taken captive when a coalition of kings waged war against the cities of the Jordan Valley, including Sodom and Gomorrah. When Abraham heard of Lot's capture, he gathered 318 trained men from his household and set out on a daring rescue mission. Against overwhelming odds, he defeated the enemy kings, rescued Lot, and recovered all the plunder that had been taken. As he returned victorious, a mysterious figure stepped into the scene: Melchizedek, the king of Salem. Unlike the other kings, he did not come to make demands or claim a share of the spoils. Instead, he came with bread and wine, offering a blessing in the name of El Elyon, God Most High. This was no ordinary encounter. Melchizedek was both a king and a priest, an unusual combination in ancient times. Kings ruled and priests served in temples, but Melchizedek embodied both roles. He was described as the priest of God Most High, a title unique in the biblical narrative. There was no record of his lineage, no mention of his birth or death, which made his identity even more mysterious. Some scholars believe he was simply a historical king and priest, while others argue that he was a divine figure, possibly a pre-incarnate appearance of Christ himself. But this meeting was not just about receiving a blessing, it was also a test of Abraham's faithfulness. After Melchizedek blessed him, Abraham responded in a remarkable way. Without hesitation, he gave Melchizedek a tenth of everything he had, an act of worship and recognition that everything he possessed ultimately belonged to God. This moment foreshadowed the tithe later commanded in the law of Moses, establishing a principle of giving back to God as an acknowledgement of his provision. Immediately after this encounter, another king approached Abraham, the king of Sodom. Unlike Melchizedek, this king had no blessing to offer, only a deal. He told Abraham to keep the recovered goods for himself and simply return the people. It was a tempting offer, a chance to profit from the battle he had just won. Yet Abraham refused. He declared that he would take nothing, lest the king of Sodom say, "I have made Abram rich." This contrast between Melchizedek and the king of Sodom was striking. One represented divine authority, blessing, and righteousness. The other symbolized worldly wealth, compromise, and corruption. In choosing to honor Melchizedek and reject the riches of Sodom, Abraham showed where his true allegiance lay, with God, not with the fleeting rewards of the world. The encounter with Melchizedek was brief, yet it carried profound significance. Centuries must have crept in. Had he misunderstood? Had he done something wrong? Would the promise ever truly come to pass? God knew that Abraham's faith needed to be solidified, and so he prepared a moment that would not only reassure him, but seal the promise forever. A covenant written not in ink, but in blood. God, in His infinite wisdom, did not leave Abraham in his uncertainty. He came to him once more, not just with words of reassurance, but with a sacred act that would bind his promise in an unbreakable covenant. This was no ordinary agreement, no simple exchange of vows. It was something ancient, something solemn, something that would change history forever. God did not simply promise Abraham a great nation. He sealed it with an ancient covenant. In obedience, Abraham prepared the animals as God instructed, cutting them in half and laying the pieces on the ground. The weight of the moment was heavy, the air thick with silence. Abraham knew what this meant. This was the way kings and rulers made unbreakable treaties in the ancient world. Two parties would pass between the split carcasses, signifying that if either one broke the covenant, they would suffer the same fate as the sacrificed animals. It was a blood oath, a binding contract that could not be undone. But then, something unexpected happened. As the sun set, a deep, overwhelming darkness fell over Abraham. It was not just the darkness of night. It was something more, something deeper, something spiritual. A thick dread settled upon him, as if he were standing on the edge of eternity itself. And in the midst of that heavy silence, God spoke. A prophecy came forth, not just about Abraham, but about his descendants. They would not have an easy journey. They would be strangers in a land not their own. They would be enslaved, oppressed for 400 years, suffering under the weight of a foreign nation's rule. But God, in His justice, would not leave them there. He would judge the oppressors. He would bring His people out with great possessions. The suffering would not be forever. The promise would not be forgotten. The land would still be theirs. Then, through the darkness, something incredible happened. A smoking fire pot and a blazing torch appeared, moving between the pieces of the sacrifice. Fire and smoke, symbols of divine presence, the same elements that would later lead the Israelites through the wilderness. But Abraham did not walk through the sacrifice. Only God did. This was not a covenant between equals. This was a declaration from the Almighty Himself. He alone would uphold the promise. He alone would bear the responsibility. If this covenant were ever broken, it would be God who would take the consequences upon Himself. It was a moment beyond human understanding. The Creator of the universe, binding Himself to a man, swearing by His own name, making a promise that could never be undone. The covenant was sealed, not just with words, but with blood, with fire, with the very presence of God. And so, the course of history was set. The land was promised. The nation would come. The trials would unfold, but through it all, God's faithfulness would remain. This was not just about Abraham. It was about something far greater. It was the beginning of a divine plan, one that would stretch through generations, leading not only to a chosen people, but to a greater covenant, a greater sacrifice, and an even greater promise that would one day be fulfilled through Christ. The night of the covenant was more than just an agreement. It was a moment where heaven touched earth, where eternity whispered into time, and where a man stood in the presence of God and received a promise that would never be broken. But as Abraham carried this divine promise in his heart, he soon found himself facing a test of an entirely different kind. This time, It was not about his own future, but the fate of others. Just as he was beginning to grasp the depth of God's covenant, another challenge arose, one that would force him to confront the delicate balance between judgment and mercy. It was a test that would push him to stand in the gap between divine wrath and human frailty, a test that would shape the way he understood God's righteousness. Would Abraham, the man chosen to be the father of nations, intercede for those who had strayed too far? Would he plead for mercy on behalf of the wicked? What followed was one of the most extraordinary conversations between man and God, a desperate plea for the doomed cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. One day, as Abraham sat near the entrance of his tent in the heat of the day, he looked up and saw 3 figures standing nearby. Without hesitation, he rushed to greet them, bowing low to the ground in an act of reverence. There was something extraordinary about these visitors. Though they appeared as men, they carried an undeniable presence, one that filled the air with both mystery and holiness. Abraham, ever the hospitable servant, hurried to prepare a meal. He called for Sarah to bake fresh bread, while he selected a tender calf and had it prepared for his guests. As they ate under the shade of the great trees, one of them spoke, a voice that carried weight, a voice that seemed to know the past, the present, and the future. "Where is your wife, Sarah?" the visitor asked. Abraham gestured toward the tent. "She is inside." Then came a promise so impossible that Sarah, hidden within the tent, could not help but laugh. "I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah your wife will have a son." Sarah, long past childbearing age, could not believe such words. But the visitor knew. Why did Sarah laugh? Is anything too hard for the Lord? It was then that Abraham understood. This was no ordinary visitor. This was the Lord himself, appearing in human form, accompanied by 2 angels. But just as quickly as the promise was given, the conversation took a somber turn. As the visitors prepared to leave, the Lord turned to Abraham and revealed a dark truth. The outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is great. Their sin is grievous. I will go down and see if what they have done is as bad as the outcry that has reached me. The words must have struck Abraham like a bolt of lightning. He knew these cities well. He had once rescued his nephew Lot from danger there. And now, the cities were on the brink of destruction. Most men would have accepted the decree without question, unwilling to challenge the will of the Almighty. But Abraham was different. He did something few would dare. He stood before the Lord, not in defiance, but in intercession. He pleaded, he bargained. "Will you sweep away the righteous with the wicked?" His voice was steady, but filled with urgency. "What if there are 50 righteous people in the city? Will you really destroy it and not spare it for their sake?" The Lord listened. "If I find 50 righteous people in the city, I will spare it for their sake." Abraham hesitated. He had seen the wickedness of Sodom and Gomorrah. He knew how few the righteous might be. And so, with humility and boldness, he asked again, "What if there are 45? The Lord agreed. "What if there are 40? Again, the Lord agreed. Abraham's heart pounded. He was pushing the boundaries of what seemed possible, yet God did not rebuke him. Instead, he listened. "What if 30? What if 20? Each time the Lord responded with patience, revealing his mercy. Finally, Abraham asked one last time, his voice barely above a whisper, "What if only 10 can be found there?" And the Lord answered, "For the sake of 10, I will not destroy it." It was a breathtaking moment. The God of the universe, the creator of all things, had allowed a man to stand before him and plead for mercy. And in that moment, Abraham learned something profound. Not only was God just, but he was also compassionate. He was willing to relent, willing to listen, willing to show mercy for the sake of even a few. But deep down, Abraham must have known. Sodom and Gomorrah were places of darkness, of unchecked sin, of people who had long abandoned the ways of righteousness. Would 10 righteous souls be found there? The Lord and his 2 angels departed, and Abraham was left alone, watching as the sun dipped below the horizon. His heart was heavy with uncertainty, with hope, with fear. And that night, the judgment came. Fire and sulfur rained from the heavens, consuming the cities in a divine reckoning. The cries of the wicked were drowned by the flames, their deeds judged, their rebellion answered. Only Lot and his family escaped, urged by the angels to flee before the destruction came. But even in their escape, tragedy struck. Lot's wife, unable to resist one final look at the doomed city, turned back, and in an instant, she was turned to a pillar of salt. Abraham awoke early the next morning and hurried to the place where he had stood before the Lord. As he looked toward the valley, smoke rose from the land like the smoke of a furnace. The cities were gone. The wicked had perished. And yet, despite the devastation, there was something Abraham understood more deeply than ever before. His relationship with God was not just about obedience, but about conversation. It was about trust, about pleading on behalf of others, about standing in the gap between judgment and mercy. He had learned that God was willing to listen, willing to consider, willing to save. And though Sodom and Gomorrah were no more, the lesson remained. Faith was not just about receiving promises. It was about interceding for those in need, about standing before God with a heart that mirrored his own. And in that moment, as the wind carried the scent of smoke across the land, Abraham understood his role in God's plan more than ever before. But if you thought Abraham's journey was difficult, nothing compares to what happened on Mount Moriah. Abraham had walked with God for many years. He had left his homeland, wandered through foreign lands, and waited decades for the son God had promised him. And finally, Isaac was born, his miracle child, the one through whom God's covenant would continue. Abraham loved Isaac more than anything. But then God gave him a command that shook him to the core. After finally receiving the son he was promised, God gave him an unthinkable command. Take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the land of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you. How could this be? Isaac was the child of promise. Through him, Abraham's descendants were supposed to become as numerous as the stars. But despite the unimaginable weight of this command, Abraham didn't argue. He didn't question, he simply obeyed. Early the next morning, he saddled his donkey, took 2 servants and Isaac, and set out for Moriah. For 3 days, they traveled in silence. And as they approached the mountain, Isaac, carrying the wood for the sacrifice, turned to his father and asked, "Father, we have the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the offering?" Abraham's heart must have ached, but his faith did not waver. He simply replied, "God will provide the lamb, my son." When they reached the place, Abraham built an altar, arranged the wood, and bound Isaac. Then, with his hands trembling but his faith firm, he lifted the knife to take his son's life. But at that moment, a voice from heaven called out, "Abraham, Abraham, do not lay a hand on the boy. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld your son from me." Abraham looked up and saw a ram caught in a thicket. God had provided a sacrifice, just as Abraham had said. He untied Isaac and offered the ram in his place. And on that mountain, Abraham called the place Yahweh Yireh, meaning, "The Lord will provide." This was the ultimate test, not just of obedience, but of trust. Abraham believed that even if Isaac died, God would raise him back to life. And because of his faith, God reaffirmed his promise. Abraham's descendants would be as countless as the stars, and through them, all nations would be blessed. Little did the world know that this moment pointed to an even greater sacrifice to come, one where another beloved son would carry the wood for his own offering. But this time, there would be no ram to take his place. Abraham's story is not just ancient history. It's a story that continues to shape the world today. His faith, his trials, and his obedience laid the foundation for 3 of the world's major religions. His descendants would go on to form nations, and his covenant with God would be fulfilled in ways he could never have imagined. But more than that, Abraham's journey is a lesson for all of us. He wasn't perfect. He doubted, he made mistakes, and he questioned God. Yet, through it all, he kept moving forward. His faith wasn't about never failing. It was about never giving up. And isn't that what faith really is? Trusting in something greater than ourselves, even when we don't have all the answers? Abraham's story reminds us that faith is a journey, not a destination. That obedience sometimes means stepping into the unknown, and that God's promises are always fulfilled, even if they take longer than we expect. So as we reflect on the life of Abraham, let's ask ourselves, where is God calling us to trust Him more? What steps of faith are we hesitating to take? Because just like Abraham, our stories are still being written. And who knows, maybe the greatest chapters are yet to come, but we cannot walk this journey alone. Just as Abraham relied on God's guidance, we, too, must seek His strength and wisdom. Let us now come before the Lord, asking for the faith to trust Him in all things, just as Abraham did. Let's take a moment to prepare our hearts for prayer. Heavenly Father, just as you called Abraham to step into the unknown, you call us to trust you in ways that stretch our faith and challenge our understanding. Today, we come before you, asking for the same unwavering trust that Abraham had, the faith to walk forward even when we cannot see the path ahead. Lord, in a world filled with uncertainties, where fear, doubt, and hardship often cloud our vision, help us to remember that you are the same God who guided and provided for Abraham. When we struggle to believe in your promises, remind us that your word never fails. When fear grips our hearts, remind us that you are our protector, just as you shielded Abraham through every trial. And when we feel lost, remind us that you are leading us, just as you led Abraham toward the land you had prepared for him. Give us the strength to surrender our plans, our desires, and even our fears into your loving hands. Teach us to wait patiently, knowing that your promises will always be fulfilled in your perfect time, even when the wait feels long and uncertain. In moments of weakness, let our faith grow stronger, and in times of testing, help us to rely on you completely. May our lives be a reflection of your faithfulness, and may we walk in obedience just as Abraham did, trusting that you are always working for our good. In Jesus' name, amen. But what happened to Isaac after that fateful day? His story holds even more mysteries, ones that will leave you in awe. If you're ready to uncover the next chapter, that's a revelation waiting for you in our next video. Here in The Whispers of the Bible.